My daughter-in-law leaned across the polished walnut table at the law firm, close enough that I could smell her perfume, and she whispered loud enough for the paralegal to hear, "You should have stayed home, Pop. Save yourself the embarrassment." She had this little half-smile on her face, the kind a cat gets right before it knocks something off the counter. My son sat next to her in a navy suit I'd paid for 2 birthdays ago, scrolling on his phone, not even looking at me. The lawyer hadn't opened the folder yet. The will hadn't been read. But they already knew I was walking out of that conference room with nothing, and they wanted me to feel it before the words were even said. What they didn't know, what neither of them had bothered to figure out in 38 years of being raised in my house and 7 years of being married to my son, was that the woman whose estate we were about to discuss had spent the last decade of her life making sure that smile would die on my daughter-in-law's face. My name is Wendell Carraway. I'm 69 years old. I spent 41 years as a structural welder on petrochemical plants down on the Gulf Coast, and what happened in that conference room on a Tuesday morning in late October is the story of how a man who never made more than $92,000 a year ended up holding the leash on a $41 million estate. If you've ever been written off by your own blood, tap that like button and tell me in the comments what state you're watching from. I want to know how many of us are out here. Let me back up. My ex-wife Loretta died on a Sunday morning in early October. Pancreatic. She'd known about it for 14 months and didn't tell a soul except her doctor and me. We'd been divorced on paper for 9 years by then, but that piece of paper was the only divorced thing about us. Loretta and I split for tax reasons. She inherited her father's wholesale lumber operation outside of Beaumont in 1998, turned it into a regional building supply company, then turned that into a holding outfit that owned 3 apartment complexes, a self-storage chain, and a strip of commercial real estate up and down I-10. By 2015, she was worth real money, and her CPA told her flat out that if she stayed legally tied to a welder who carried liability on a torch every day, one bad workplace accident and a hungry attorney could put a straw in her empire. So we signed the papers. We kept the same bed. I moved into a 1-bedroom rental on the east side of town that she quietly owned through one of her LLCs. And on Sunday mornings she'd drive over with 2 coffees from the place on Calder Avenue, and we'd sit on my little concrete patio and talk about her week. Our son Brennan never knew. He saw what he wanted to see. He saw a mother who drove a Range Rover and lived in a 4,000-square-foot house in the West End. And he saw a father who drove a 2009 Silverado and lived in what he once called, to my face, at his own rehearsal dinner, the kind of place where people microwave their dinner. His wife Skylar laughed when he said it. I remember because I was the one paying for the rehearsal dinner. The funeral was at Magnolia Hill Cemetery. It rained the whole service, that warm coastal rain that doesn't cool anything off, just soaks you slow. I wore the same charcoal suit I'd worn to my own mother's funeral in 2003. Brennan was up front under the canopy with Skylar, both of them in matching black, her holding an umbrella over him like he was royalty. I walked up to take my place beside my son, and he turned around, saw me, and stepped sideways to block me. "Family seating only, Pop," he said. He had his mother's eyes, but none of her warmth in them. "Why don't you stand back by Aunt Renelle and them?" Skylar's live streaming for her followers, and the angles get weird if you're in the shot. I looked at Skylar. She had her phone propped against a floral arrangement on the casket. The casket. She had her phone leaning against the casket. I didn't argue. I walked back through the wet grass to stand under a live oak 50 feet from the woman I'd loved for 43 years, and I watched her go in the ground from a distance. After the service, while people were still filing past the grave, Skylar walked over to me on her stilettos, ankles wobbling in the soft mud, and she handed me a manila envelope. "Crisp, new, from the estate," she said, and she actually smiled at me. I opened it standing in the rain. It was a notice to vacate. Brennan had filed it that morning. The apartment I'd been living in for 9 years was owned by Loretta's LLC, and as of 9:47 a.m. that day, the LLC had a new managing officer. My son. He was giving me 72 hours to clear out. Brennan walked over while I was still holding the paper. He didn't apologize. He didn't soften it. He said, "Look, Pop, Mom's gone, and the gravy train ended with her. I'm liquidating that property. You've got till Friday." He patted me on the shoulder twice, that condescending double tap, and he walked off to his leased BMW with his wife. I stood there in the cemetery in the rain holding an eviction notice, and I'll tell you the honest truth, I didn't feel sad. I felt clear, the way the air feels right before a hurricane hits the coast and everything goes still and you know exactly what you have to do. I pulled out my phone, and I called a man named Hollis Ardmore. He'd been Loretta's attorney since 1996. I said, "They served me at the graveside." Hollis was quiet for about 3 seconds. Then he said, "Wendell, I'll see you in my office at 9 a.m. tomorrow. Wear the suit, the one she bought you for our last Christmas party." I hung up and I drove to a Whataburger off College Street, and I sat in a booth and ordered a coffee and ate nothing, and I thought about numbers. $41 million in total estate value. 3 commercial properties, a residential portfolio, $80 million in liquid investments, and against that I thought about the numbers my son didn't know I knew. $140,000 in delinquent quarterly tax payments on a side business he'd registered without telling his mother. $86,000 on 3 credit cards in Skylar's name. And a personal loan from a hard money lender out of Houston that Brennan had taken out 6 months ago against a property he didn't own yet. He'd forged his mother's signature on the application. I knew because she'd shown me the letter from the lender, the one she got when they tried to verify, and she'd cried at my kitchen table and said, "Wendell, I don't know what to do with him anymore." That was 4 months before she died. I never told her what I was going to do, but I started doing it that night. The next morning I drove to Hollis Ardmore's office in downtown Beaumont, 12th floor of one of those mirrored buildings that look like they're trying to apologize for being there. Brennan and Skylar were already in the conference room when I walked in. Brennan had a coffee. Skylar was on her phone, legs crossed, foot bouncing. They both looked up when I came in. And Brennan actually laughed. "Pop, I told you not to come. This is gonna be embarrassing." I didn't answer. I sat in a chair near the door. Hollis came in, sat at the head of the table, opened the leather binder, and started reading. He went through the assets first. 41 million, give or take. Skylar made a little noise when he said the number. Like a hiccup. Brennan squeezed her hand. Horace read on. "To my ex-husband, Wendell Carraway, I leave nothing." Brennan slapped the table. He actually slapped it. "Yes, there it is. There it is, Pop. In writing." Skylar laughed, that loud, bright laugh she did for her camera. I didn't move. I looked at the carpet. Horace cleared his throat and turned the page. "However," he said. Brennan stopped laughing. "However, all assets of the estate are hereby transferred in their entirety to the Loretta May Carraway Family Stewardship Trust." Brennan said, "Okay, fine, a trust, whatever. I'm the beneficiary. Just tell me when I can access it." Hollis looked at him for a long moment. Then Hollis said, "Mr. Carraway, you misunderstand. The trust is irrevocable and discretionary. You are the beneficiary, yes, But you do not control the assets. The trustee controls everything. Distributions, sales, leases, investments, every dollar that moves in or out of that trust requires the trustee's signature. Brennan said, Then who's the trustee? Hollis looked at me. He didn't even point. He just looked, and Brennan followed his eyes, and the color drained out of my son's face in real time. I watched it go. He said, him. Hollis said, Your father, yes. Sole trustee. Full discretionary authority. He controls every penny. Skylar stood up. She actually stood up. Knocking her chair back, she screamed, That's not legal. That can't be legal. He's broke. Look at him. I stood up too. I'd been waiting to stand up for 9 years. I walked to the head of the table. Hollis stood and pulled out his chair for me. I sat down. I opened the binder, not to the will but to the second tab, the one Hollis had prepared for me 3 weeks ago when Loretta gave him the final instructions from her hospital bed. I put on my reading glasses, the wire-rimmed prescription ones, not the drugstore cheaters Brennan had seen me wear at Thanksgiving. I looked at my son over the top of them. I said, Brennan, the hard money lender out of Houston called Loretta in May. They wanted to verify the signature on a $190,000 promissory note dated April 14th. Your mother told them the signature was forged. She didn't press charges because she wanted to give you a chance to come clean. You never did. Brennan's mouth opened. Nothing came out. I turned a page. I said, Skylar, the IRS sent your mother-in-law a courtesy notice in June about 3 credit accounts opened using her social security number. The applications were submitted from an IP address registered to your home. Skylar sat down. Hard. I closed the binder. I said, As trustee, I have a fiduciary obligation to protect this estate from waste and from theft. Paying off your fraudulent debts does not qualify as a prudent use of trust assets. The answer is no. To everything. For now. Brennan stood up. He came around the table fast. He was reaching for me. I don't know if he meant to grab my collar or hit me. I'll never know, because 2 men in dark suits stepped out of the side office where Hollis had stashed them that morning, and one of them put a hand on Brennan's chest and the other one closed the conference room door. Brennan went back to his seat without being told. I said, Now, about the apartment on Magnolia Bend. I've decided to accept the terms of your eviction. Brennan looked confused. I said, I'll be out by Friday, but effective immediately as trustee, I am terminating your occupancy of the residence at 4408 Beaufort Lane. That property is a trust asset. You and your wife have been living there rent-free for 14 months. You have until Sunday to vacate. Skylar made that hiccup sound again. Brennan said, Where are we supposed to go? I said, There's a 1-bedroom on Magnolia Bend available Saturday. Rent's $1,200 a month, payable to the trust. I'll need first, last, and a security deposit, in certified funds. I stood up. I said, Meeting adjourned. I walked out of that conference room and I rode the elevator down 12 floors, and I stood on the sidewalk in the October sun and I cried for about 90 seconds because Loretta wasn't there to see it. And then I wiped my face with my handkerchief and I called Hollis from the curb and I said, Phase 1 is done. Move on, Phase 2. He said, Wendell, your son is going to get desperate. I said, I'm counting on it. For 3 days, I stayed in a Holiday Inn off the interstate. I didn't answer Brennan's calls. There were 47 of them by Thursday morning. I watched Skylar's Instagram instead. She went live Wednesday night, crying into a glass of Chardonnay in her parents' kitchen in Lumberton, telling her followers that her husband's father had stolen their inheritance. That I was a controlling narcissist who'd emotionally abused her mother-in-law for decades. That I'd somehow tricked a dying woman into signing over $41 million. She had a donation link in her bio. By Thursday afternoon, it had pulled in $6,000 from strangers. I sipped my coffee and I let her dig. On Friday morning, I was served with a petition Brennan had filed for emergency guardianship over me, claiming I had early-onset dementia and was not competent to administer the trust. He had an affidavit from a doctor I had never met in my life, a man named Lyle Easterbrook, who ran a sleep clinic out of a strip mall in Orange. Easterbrook claimed in his affidavit that he had examined me 3 times over the past year and observed significant cognitive decline. The man had never been in the same building as me. I called Hollis. He said, "It's a stall. He's trying to freeze the trust until the competency hearing, which could take months." I said, "He doesn't have months. Easterbrook's a paid liar. Send a private investigator to the strip mall and document everything that doctor does for the next 48 hours. I want to know who pays him, who refers to him, what insurance fraud he's running on the side, and file a counter motion for an independent evaluation today." Hollis said, "Wender, you sure?" I said, "Loretta told me once that her father used to say the worst thing about being underestimated is that you waste a lot of energy not correcting people. I'm not wasting any more energy." That afternoon I drove out to the house at 408 Beaufort Lane. The house Loretta had bought for cash in 2017. The house Brennan and Skylar had been squatting in since Loretta got too sick to drive. I had a key. I let myself in. Brennan was in the living room on a leather couch. I'd watched my wife pick out at a showroom in Houston, and he was on a video call with someone, and on the coffee table in front of him were 9 pieces of jewelry. Loretta's jewelry. Her mother's pearls. The diamond solitaire I'd put on her finger in 1981 at a courthouse in Galveston when we had $93 between us. He was selling them on a live stream. 2 buyers. I walked into the living room and I said, "Hang up the phone." Brennan jumped about a foot. The buyer on the screen, some man in a polo shirt, said, "Who's that?" I said, "I'm the trustee, and every item on that table is property of the Loretta May Caraway Family Stewardship Trust. If you complete this transaction, you are receiving stolen goods, and I have your face on this screen." The man on the call disconnected so fast the screen flickered. Brennan stood up. He said, "You can't just walk in here." I said, "I can. The deed is in the trust. I am the trust. As of 3 days ago, I am every wall and every floorboard and every blade of grass on this property, and you are a guest who has worn out his welcome." He came at me. "I want you to understand, my own son came at me. He had his fist drawn back. I didn't move. I'd already called the Beaumont police on the way over, told them I was a trustee responding to an unauthorized sale of estate property, and 2 officers walked through the front door at exactly that moment. They didn't arrest him. It was a civil matter, but they escorted him and Skylar out, and Skylar was screaming at them about her followers and her platform and her rights, and one of the officers, a young woman, looked at me on the way out and just gave me a tiny, almost invisible nod, like she'd seen this kind of thing before. I sat down on the leather couch alone in that big, quiet house. I picked up the diamond solitaire, the one I'd put on Loretta's finger when I was 26 and she was 24 and we had nothing. I held it in my hand and I cried the second time that week. Then I walked into the home office Loretta had built in what used to be the formal dining room, and I opened the bottom drawer of her desk. There was a false back. I'd built the desk for her in 2009, when we still pretended we were getting divorced for tax reasons and not because we'd already drifted apart on paper. I knew about the false back because I cut it myself. Inside was a sealed envelope with my name on it in her handwriting and a small leather notebook. I opened the envelope first. The letter was 3 pages, single-spaced, in her tight square handwriting. I'm not going to read you the whole thing. Some of it is between her and me, but the part that matters said this: Wendell, if you are reading this, then Brennan has done what we were both afraid he would do. I have paid off his debts twice. I bailed him out of the Vegas situation in 2019 and the IRS audit in 2021. He has never said thank you. He has never asked how I am. He calls when he needs money. I have spent my whole life building something, and I refuse to let it be poured down the drain of his addictions and her vanity. Be the wall, Rendell. Be the wall I couldn't be. He cannot grow until something stops him, and I'm not there anymore to stop him. You are. I love you. Be the wall. I sat at her desk and I read that letter 4 times. Then I called Hollis. I said, initiate phase 3. I want to buy his debt. Here's what most people don't understand about hard money lenders. They will sell you a bad note for 60 cents on the dollar if you walk in with cash and a story. The lender in Houston, an outfit called Bayou Capital Holdings, was sitting on a $190,000 note with a forged signature on it. The minute I told them what I had told them, that the signature was forged, that the borrower had no assets, that the loan was effectively uncollectible, they couldn't get rid of it fast enough. I bought it for $115,000 of my own personal retirement savings. I bought the 3 credit card accounts in Loretta's name through a debt buyer for $42,000. I bought a separate $40,000 gambling marker Brennan had floating with a sportsbook in Lake Charles for $18,000. Friday of the 2nd week, I owned every dollar my son owed in the world. He didn't know it yet. He thought he was hiding from his creditors. He didn't realize all his creditors had become one creditor, and that creditor was sitting in a Holiday Inn drinking room service coffee, waiting for him to make his next move. The next move came on a Tuesday morning. Brennan and Skylar had moved into a short-term rental Skylar's father owned, a 1-bedroom condo near the airport. They were running out of money fast. Skylar's GoFundMe had stalled at $14,000 and then YouTube demonetized her after my attorney sent the platform a cease and desist documenting the defamation. Brennan called me from a blocked number. I let it ring 4 times and picked up. He said, "Pop, we need to talk." "Just you and me, no lawyers." I said, "Tomorrow, 2 p.m. I'll pick the place." I picked a diner off 11th Street. Brennan walked in wearing a hoodie and jeans. He'd lost weight in 2 weeks. He sat across from me in the booth, and he didn't even pretend to read the menu. He said, "Pop, the guys I borrowed from in Houston, they've gone quiet. That's worse than them calling. I think they sold my note." I sipped my coffee. I said, "They did." He said, "To who?" I said, "To me." He didn't say anything for a long time. He looked at his hands. Then he said, "How much?" I said, $115. I also own the credit cards and the Lake Charles marker, all of it, about $347,000 in face value, and I'm holding all of it personally, not the trust. He looked up at me. I'd never seen him look that scared. Not when he was 8 and broke his arm jumping off the garage roof, not when he totaled his first car at 17, not at his mother's funeral. He said, "What do you want?" I said, "I want you to drop the guardianship petition by 5 p.m. today. I want you to fire that doctor and never use him again. I want a signed confession from you, notarized, acknowledging the forged signature on the Bayou note, and I want you to spend the next 2 years working at the lumberyard your grandfather started. The one your mother kept open out of sentiment, even when it was losing money. You'll start at $22 an hour. You will live in the apartment I'm vacating on the east side. You will pay rent like a grown man. You will not touch a dollar of the trust during that time. At the end of 2 years, if you've shown up every day, if you've stayed clean, if you've made things right with your wife or left her like an honest man, then we'll talk about a distribution, not before. He said, or what? I said, or I file the criminal complaint on the Bayou note tomorrow morning. Forgery on a financial instrument over $50,000 is a second-degree felony in Texas. 2 to 20 years. I have the original application. Your mother saved it. He said he'd really do that to me. I said, your mother spent 43 years trying to do anything but that, and it didn't fix you. So now we try the other thing. He cried at the table. Real crying, not the kind he used to do as a kid to get out of trouble. I let him. I drank my coffee and I waited. After a while, he wiped his face with a napkin and he said, Skylar's not going to stay if there's no money. I said, then you'll know what she was, and you'll be free to find someone better. He signed everything in Hollis's office at 4:30 that afternoon. Skylar didn't last 3 weeks. She moved out, moved back in with her parents in Lumberton, filed for divorce, and went on TikTok to claim she'd been the real victim all along. The algorithm didn't care anymore. Her engagement collapsed. Brennan started at the lumberyard on a Monday in mid-November. The yard manager, a man named Otis Pomeroy, who'd worked for Loretta's father since the 80s, didn't cut him an inch of slack. Brennan loaded trucks. He restocked rebar. He came home with splinters in his palms and diesel in his clothes, and for the first 2 months he called me every Sunday night to complain, and I let him, and then around the 3rd month he stopped complaining and started telling me things instead. Things he was learning. Things he was noticing. Things about the men he worked with, men who'd worked there 20, 30 years. Men who'd known his grandfather. He started asking me about his grandfather. He'd never asked me about his grandfather in his life. I told him stories about the man who'd come back from Korea with shrapnel in his leg and built a lumberyard out of nothing on a piece of land outside Beaumont and made it pay. About his grandmother who kept the books in a spiral notebook for 30 years before they could afford a bookkeeper. I told him about his mother. The real version of his mother, not the Range Rover version, the version who used to balance the lumberyard receipts on our kitchen table when we were first married, with a baby on her hip and a pencil behind her ear, and a determined look on her face that he'd inherited, although he'd pointed it the wrong direction his whole life. About 14 months into his 2 years, on a Saturday afternoon, Brennan drove out to my new place. I'd moved out of the rental on Magnolia Bend, used a small distribution from the trust, the only one I'd taken for myself, to buy a little house on 3 acres outside of Lumberton with a workshop in the back. He showed up unannounced, knocked on the door, and when I opened it, he just stood there for a second, and then he said, "Pop, I owe you an apology. I don't know how to say it yet, but I'm working on it. I just wanted you to know I'm working on it." Then he turned around and got back in his truck, an old F-150 he'd bought, used with his own paychecks, and he drove off. He hadn't called me Pop in 7 years before that conversation in the diner. He started calling me Dad again about 6 months after that visit. I won't tell you everything is fixed. It isn't. He's still got work to do, and so do I. But last month, on what would have been his mother's 70th birthday, he drove me out to Magnolia Hill Cemetery, and we stood at his mother's grave in the warm Gulf rain, and he said, "I wish I'd known her. The real one." And I said, "She knew you. The real you. Even when you didn't." That's why she did what she did. I'm 69 years old. I spent 41 years welding I-beams on petrochemical plants. I know what a load-bearing structure looks like. I know that sometimes the only way to save a building that's rotting from the inside is to strip it down to the studs and rebuild it the right way. My wife knew it too. She just didn't have the time left to do it. She handed me the blueprints and she trusted me to build it. And by God, I'm building it. If you've ever had to be the wall for somebody you love, hit that like button and let me know where you're watching from. I read every comment. Subscribe to Fallen Vengeance if you want to hear what I'm doing with the rest of that estate. There's a foundation now, Loretta's name on it. We've put 38 kids through trade school in the last 14 months. Kids from East Texas who'd otherwise be on the same road my son was on. That's the real inheritance, not the money. The chance to break the cycle. I'll see you next week. I spent 41 years welding I-beams on petrochemical plants down on the Gulf Coast, and I never made more than $92,000 a year. I tell you that because I want you to understand something. The size of a man's paycheck has nothing to do with the size of his backbone. My son Brennan spent 38 years thinking the opposite. He looked at his mother's Range Rover and his father's old Silverado, and he made up a story about who we were, and he lived inside that story until the day it cost him everything. Here's the thing I've come to understand, sitting on the porch of my little place outside Lumberton, watching the rain come in off the Gulf. Every choice we make is a seed. Loretta and I planted some good ones, and we planted some bad ones, and what came up in our son's life was the harvest of both. We compensated for our absence with money. We bailed him out instead of letting him fall. Every time we wrote a check to fix a problem we should have let him solve, we taught him that consequences were something other people had. By the time he was 30, the lesson was set like concrete. By the time he handed me that eviction notice at his mother's graveside, the concrete had cured. That's cause and effect. That's not bad luck. That's the soil we tilled. What I've learned is that there are 3 things a man has to hold on to, and if he lets go of any of them, the other 2 will start to rot. The first is his moral spine. The willingness to say no when no is the right answer, even to the people you love most, especially to the people you love most. Loretta tried to be the wall for our son and couldn't bring herself to do it. She left me the blueprints and she trusted me to finish the job. The second is the wisdom to see clearly. Skylar showed me who she was the moment she propped a phone against my wife's casket. I didn't have to wonder, I just had to be willing to see it. Most pain in a family comes from people refusing to see what is right in front of them because they're scared of what they'd have to do about it. The third is the grit to follow through. It would have been easier to let Brennan have the money and watch him burn it. Cheaper, too. Cost me $115,000 of my own retirement savings to buy that forged note from Houston. But cheap and easy. Don't build anything that lasts. My son works at the lumberyard now. He comes home with diesel on his clothes and splinters in his palms. And last month he called me Dad for the first time in 7 years. The estate is still in trust. We've put 38 kids through trade school in the last 14 months. That's what I planted with the second half of my life, and I'll be in the ground before I know if it grows. But I planted it, and that's the work.